Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCullum, and I'm here today at Morphy's taking a look at a bunch of cool guns that they have, like this Guatemalan contract Armalite AR-10. This is actually a pre-86 dealer sample, so it has not been neutered or modified in any way, which is pretty cool. It also shows a significant amount of wear, which is natural from its extended time in Guatemala. Now, the AR-10, there's so many different stories attached to the AR-10 and different topics of discussion to bring up. I thought this would be a great gun to take a look at, both because of its history and because of, well, its technical qualifications. So let's start with its history. I think most people are probably most familiar with the AR-10 as it relates to US small arms trials. The AR-10 was presented sort of as a dark horse entry against the FAL and the M14, or what would become the M14. And Armalite thought this project was going pretty well. They thought they had a really good shot at winning US Army adoption. They thought, I think many would argue correctly, that the AR-10 had the technical advantage over all of its competitors. Fundamentally, I think they would be proven right in the fact that the M16, which is essentially a scaled-down AR-10, would end up replacing the M14 in pretty short order in the 1960s. However, at this time, the AR-10 is the newest of the guns in that trial, and it doesn't have enough time under its belt, essentially, to have been improved and tweaked, and the FAL and the M14 were both ahead of it. They weren't better guns, but they were ahead of it in the timeline of development. So ultimately, in May of 1957, the M14 is formally adopted by the US military. This dashes Armalite's hopes of having the AR-10 adopted by the US military, and it leaves Armalite in kind of a tight spot because, well, what do they do with this thing now? They've got a lot of time and money invested in it, and they'd like to get something back, so they need to sell it to someone. Now, Armalite is also not a manufacturing facility. They're based in Hollywood, and they are essentially an R&D branch of the Fairchild Aircraft Company. As it happened, a couple of the executives at Fairchild Aircraft were gun guys. One of them happens to run into Eugene Stoner testing guns at a shooting range. They strike up a friendship. They really like Stoner's fancy new rifle concept, rifle design, and this all turns into, like, Fairchild will make a gun company to develop Eugene Stoner's guns, and that is Armalite. And they're going to do it with, cool modern materials, aircraft-grade aluminums and fiberglass and all sorts of fancy stuff that nobody's doing. Well, not really in the military sphere anyway. So, happily, when the US adopts the M14, Armalite is just on the cusp of finalizing a licensed production arrangement with the Dutch factory Artillerie Inrichtingen. This is a weapons factory that's existed for a long time in the Netherlands, but was in need of something to manufacture in the 1950s, and Armalite was in need of a production company because, like I said, Armalite's an R&D facility. They're based in Hollywood, California, of all places, and they can make handfuls of small batch rifles, but they're not a production line. They're not mass producing anything. Well, Artillerie Inrichtingen can. Now, there's a bit of misunderstanding, like mutual misunderstanding here, in that the Dutch at Artillerie Inrichtingen really thought that they were getting a turnkey project that they could just start producing and start selling and make a bunch of money on, when in reality the AR-10 still needed some development to it and was still in its teething stages. And I think Armalite was under this notion that AI would be able to tool up production and just start producing rifles faster than they actually could. So neither side was entirely happy with the arrangement, but it went through anyway. In June of 1957, Armalite officially licenses production, gives an exclusive production license to AI. Now the question is, how do we sell these rifles? There are a lot of countries out there, especially big NATO countries, that are in the process of looking for a battle rifle, something to replace old bolt-action rifles. They haven't adopted anything yet, and the market is ripe for the AR-10 to make a splash and get adopted somewhere. So Armalite ends up with this Armalite ends up with a three-pronged marketing approach. They have three separate salesmen that they work with, who each get separate districts in separate worldwide territories to work in. Now, the guy who gets the prime NATO Western European territories to work in is a guy named Jacques Michaud. He has connections to AI in the Netherlands and should be well connected in Europe. And so that's his territory, and that's the really valuable one where they think they've got the best chance, and certainly have the best chance of a really fundamentally large order. There's another salesman named Bobby McDonald who has some experience in Southeast Asia. He gets essentially the entire Asian market to market to, and these are all contract salesmen, or commission salesmen, sorry. They will get a cut of sales that they make, so they have this incentive to go out and sell a bunch of rifles. Now, the third guy is the reason that actual AR-10 sales are distributed across a bunch of countries that you would definitely not expect to have been buying state-of-the-art, high-tech, modern small arms in 1957. Countries like Cuba, Guatemala, and Sudan. Well, the reason for those sales is because Sam Cummings made it happen. He was by far the best of the salesmen that Armalite had. And we'll talk about how he got introduced to Armalite in a moment. But first, a little background on Sam Cummings. He worked as an analyst for the CIA, specifically as a small arms expert. He was originally self-taught. He is a gun nut in the best and totally stereotypical sense. Loved firearms, fantastically interested in them, leveraged a self-education in military small arms into a job working for the CIA as a small arms analyst. He did some travel in Western Europe in the years just after World War II and noticed that there were mountains of small arms and munitions still just lying around after the war. He then ends up doing some analysis of small arms from the Korean War for the CIA. And by 1953, he decides to quit his job at the agency and instead form his own company. He's seeing all of these guns that are available out, potentially available as surplus, and he thinks he can do really well by this, and frankly, it'd be a really interesting career. Why not give it a try? So he quits his job in 1953, and he forms IAC, which is the International Armaments Corporation, which is essentially a one-man company run by Sam Cummings for a number of years until he starts to really hit it big. Now, in around 1957, he's made some progress, he's made some big deals. He is intelligent, capable, and becomes very successful. IAC will eventually become CIA, Century Arms International. No relation to CIA, except he was with the CIA. Anyway, long story. He did covert work for the US government during this time as well as probably the most significant arms dealer, Western arms dealer at least, of the 20th century. Tremendous amounts of what we have today are the result of Sam Cummings buying stuff. He was responsible for bringing all of the weird miscellaneous small arms from Spain's arsenals into the United States. He brought, he altered the course of modern military history with some of the deals that he made. Now, the story of how Sam Cummings got introduced to Armalite is a fantastic one, and it's basically they happened to meet up at a shoot. A guy named Richard Boutte, who was one of the executives at the Fairchild Aircraft Company and one of the main driving forces behind Armalite, he has a farm outside of the DC area, and he sets up a shoot with some friends. Like, just come on out, we're going to shoot some old guns, we're going to have some fun, it'll be great. So he's there, Charles Dorchester is there, another one of the driving forces behind the AR-10, and Eugene Stoner is there, which kind of makes sense. Stoner's working for Armalite at the time. They have a number of Armalite guns out at this shoot. They've got some AR-1s, the Parasniper, they've got some AR-5s, they've got early AR-10s, and then they invite some other guys to come join them and just have a good time. And one of the guys that gets invited is Sam Cummings. Now, Sam Cummings brings his personal FG-42 that he has acquired out of Europe. He brought an MG-42 because back then and today, everyone loves shooting MG-42s. That's a lot of fun. Who else is there? Val Forget Sr. is there. We've actually done some videos with Val Forget's son talking about Val Forget's involvement in the small arms surplus industry. You know, this is just a couple of years after Val Forget has cleared Bannerman Island. He started basically created the market for reproduction Old West small arms with his work with Aldo Uberti in Italy. He's at this shoot. George Chin is there. George Chin is the author of the U.S. Navy's manual, not manual, like 7-volume treatise on machine guns, what they are and how they work. George Chin is probably the preeminent, most knowledgeable firearms expert in the United States at that time. And he comes out to this shoot as well. And one of these guys, I can't remember who it was, one of these guys also brings a world standard Maxim, model 1889 Maxim that he had bought from Hudson Maxim's estate. And these guys are just hanging out at the farm, having a good time shooting, and people get introduced to the AR-10. George Chin, this is George Chin's introduction to the AR-10. It's also Sam Cummings' introduction to the AR-10. And both of those guys are really taken aback by how amazing the AR-10 is as a rifle. And they're both extremely interested in it. And apparently at that time, Sam Cummings tries to get exclusive worldwide rights to market it, which are turned down. But he maintains connections with the company, and he ends up getting the exclusive distribution sales rights to Central and South America, because that's where he's got a lot of experience already from working with governments and leaders and such. He also has some territories in Africa that he's given access to, and he'll kind of just expand on those territories and take every opportunity to sell the gun everywhere that he can. So when they start this sales process, each one of these 3 salesmen buys a sample rifle to use as their demonstration gun. Sam Cummings, being a collector gun nut sort of guy, specifically grabs gun number 1001, the first production prototype AR-10, and he embarks on like a year-long tour of Central and South America demonstrating this thing to everyone, basically everyone, every country in Central and South America. And he gets a decent amount of interest. He actually gets a very serious interest from Nicaragua, which goes badly. They get sent a sample gun that shears some locking lugs because of poor assembly, but that's a separate issue. Late in 1957, he stops in at Guatemala with gun number 1001 and demonstrates it to the Guatemalan military. And they kind of go straight from what's that rifle to yes, please sign us up, and they place an order for 450 of the guns, specifically for use by their Escuela Politécnica, their military school, essentially Guatemalan version of West Point. They're going to use the guns there for training and trials, and maybe, if it goes well, they'll buy a whole ton of them and equip the entire army. Well, so it's late 1957 when they place this order. Artillerie Inrichtingen is still working on spinning up the production line for the guns, and it will be mid to late 1958 before the guns are delivered. But they are, in fact, delivered. All 450 of them go out to Guatemala and are well received. So with all of that background behind us, let's take a closer look at what the Guatemalans actually got. The AR-10 went through a bit of evolution during its life cycle. So first off, we had the guns that were used in the US small arms trials. Those give way to something that's a little more developed in the early style of AR-10s. And that's what you see sold to West Germany for NATO trials, to Cuba in small numbers, to Guatemala, and to Sudan. Now, like I said, these guns were produced in the second half of 1958, and this production took place just after AI finished production of the Sudanese contract rifles. Now, if we take a look at the markings here, patents are still pending at this point, but it's the Armalite AR-10 manufactured by AI, Artillerie Inrichtingen, in this triangle in the Netherlands. And the serial number here is 3159. These guns fall into a serial range of roughly between 3,000 and 3,500. There is a little bit of overlap between the beginning of the Guatemalan guns and the end of the Sudanese guns. Like, there isn't an exact serial number range, but this falls very nicely into where we expect the numbers to be. Now, each of these initial contracts has a little slight variation to it that makes them distinctive. So the Cuban guns have an open flash hider and a very thin barrel here. When Sudan places its contract, the Sudanese want to have a bayonet lug, and so they get Artillerie Inrichtingen to add this sleeve right here over the front end of the barrel with a German-style bayonet lug. So this uses a bayonet that attaches like a K98K bayonet, doesn't use a muzzle ring, just a long bayonet lug back here. That's great. Sudan gets their guns, AI simply continues their production after the Sudanese guns are done to supply Guatemala's order. The Guatemalans are pretty easy to work with. They like the bayonet thing, but they would like to have better ventilation on the front of the barrel. So AI drills some holes in that bayonet sleeve there, and that is the distinctive element of Guatemala's guns. Nobody else would get them with that ventilated bayonet shroud on them. You may have noticed the threading on the flash hider out here. That predates Guatemalan guns. That was also used on the Sudanese ones, and it's for the attachment of blank firing devices. It's actually pretty common to have a flash hider threaded either externally like this or internally for blank firing adapters. Unfortunately, the handguard can only be removed by removing the entire gas block and front sight block assembly, which I'm not going to do here. Underneath that handguard is actually a thin fluted barrel to minimize weight while maximizing stiffness. You can see a couple of the flutes there through the holes in the handguard. That thin profile barrel is distinctive of the early AR-10s, and the furniture here is made out of woven fiberglass. A lot of the Guatemalan guns are fairly heavily worn, like this one, and as they wear, the weave pattern on that fiberglass becomes more and more visible. I think that's a pretty cool effect. Now, this particular one has a normal handguard on it. The Sudanese order included some rifles with folding bipods, and by the time they started making the Guatemalan guns, there was actually a shortage of standard handguards. So some of the Guatemalans got this, which is what they were supposed to get. Some of them actually got handguards that had shaping, not cutouts in them, but that were shaped to incorporate folding bipod legs. None of the Guatemalan guns got the bipods, but a bunch of them got bipod handguards because that's all that was available at the time, and AI just went ahead and used them. Some of the other early AR-10 features include a relatively small bolt catch. We have a selector lever here that, interestingly, is actually the same setup as the early AR-15s, where it's not the selector configuration that we're used to today. Instead, safe is this middle position, forward is full auto, and the rearward position is semi-auto. This is something that would be changed in American military testing on the AR-15 because when the guns were being dragged on the ground by a crawling soldier, they discovered that dragging this on the ground could very easily flip the safety from the safe to the auto position, and then you could accidentally get a stick or a leaf or a rock or something in the trigger guard and unintentionally fire a burst out of the rifle. So by changing the selector positions to put the safe position here, which did also happen on later developments of the AR-10, you would prevent that. If anything dragged on the safety, it would put it into the safe position. The buttstock is also made out of the same sort of woven fiberglass as the front handguard. There is a spring-loaded trap in the butt plate that'll hold a cleaning kit, although there's nothing in there right now. The AR-10 included a dust cover, just like we're used to with the AR-15s, but no brass deflector, no fencing around the magazine release here, nothing like that. These do use, by the way, a waffle pattern stamped aluminum magazine, holds 20 rounds. The charging handle is up here on the top of the upper receiver, and this charging handle is the reason that there is this aluminum that we normally call a carry handle today, but that was actually originally designed to be a protective guard for the charging handle. One of the other distinctive elements of the early AR-10s is that the charging handle is a solid piece, and when you pull it back, it extends out the back of the upper receiver. There's a hole in the upper here to accommodate it, and it just comes back over the top of the stock. This was a cause of complaints, and in later pattern AR-10s, they would actually change this to a telescoping charging handle and a solid, the receiver here is solid to enclose that. The front sight is a square post that's completely fixed in place, and the rear sight is an aperture. It can be adjusted for windage up here and adjusted for elevation with a BDC cam down here built into the charging handle guard, aka carry handle. And by the way there, the range numbers are printed on that BDC elevation dial, and you can read what range you have selected through a little hole in the back of the carry handle right there. Mechanically, this gun works exactly the same way as the AR-15 because the AR-15 is essentially just a scaled down copy of the AR-10. So we have a gas port in the barrel up here in the combination gas block and front sight post, or front sight block. That gas port is connected to a gas tube right there that runs all the way back into the receiver and functions in the same sort of quasi-direct impingement system that the AR-15 uses. Now, we call this direct impingement. It is actually a gas piston built into the bolt carrier itself, which I should show you. So let's go ahead and take this apart. It disassembles just like an AR-15. The pins on this one are pretty tight. Popping out the rear pin allows me to pivot the gun open. I'm going to go ahead and take the front pin out as well so we can separate the upper and lower receivers. This should look pretty familiar to anyone who's looked inside an AR-15. Because this is unmodified, that is actually your auto sear. So when I have this in full, if I hold down the trigger, when the hammer resets, it's not actually held by the sear up here, it's held by this auto sear. And when the bolt fully closes, the back end of the bolt carrier trips this forward, which releases the hammer to drop and fire. Essentially, this takes over as the sear when you're holding the trigger down in full auto. If we switch this back to semi, it is now always recaught by the main firing sear. We can also pull out the buffer tube here. There we go. We got that guy there. So the AR-10 buffer differs a bit from the AR-15 buffer. We have a series of friction rings here in the back to help absorb the impact of this bit of weight hitting the very back end of the receiver. Moving over to the upper, we pop the charging handle back and the bolt comes out just like an AR-15. It's just rather larger than an AR-15. Charging handle comes out basically the same way as well. We have a little spring-loaded detent back here that locks into a divot in the receiver to keep this locked in the forward position. It does not reciprocate when you fire. At the front of the gas block, there is a small adjustment screw that allows you to regulate the amount of gas actually going into the gas port. So this isn't something that's set up to be like multi-position readily adjustable. It's there so that you can just tune the gun to work properly with whatever your standard ammunition is. The bolt assembly is essentially the same as an AR-15. So gas comes back into this tube. So the gas tube located down here fits into the gas tube on the bolt carrier. Gas comes in here into the bolt carrier where it acts on the bolt head or the bolt itself as piston. We can disassemble this just like an AR-15. Instead of a cotter pin, we have a nicely machined cross pin there. That allows us to pull out the firing pin. Then we can pull out the cam pin that holds the bolt in place, and there is our bolt. So your gas piston is located in this area of the bolt assembly. You can see the 3 gas sealing rings on the back of the bolt there. Again, this is the system that gets scaled down to create the AR-15. These are your gas vents. So when gas expands, it pushes the bolt head forward, which causes it to rotate to unlock. Excess gas is then vented out those ports, out the ejection port of the rifle. The bolt itself, again, just like an AR bolt, except a bit larger. There would be some revisions to this as well in later pattern ARs. The bolt lugs are made larger, rounded a bit to reduce stress points. But that's what you have with the early pattern ones. And there you go. There is one field-stripped Guatemalan contract, Dutch manufactured AR-10 battle rifle. Now the Guatemalans might have been interested in a larger follow-up order for more of their military for the AR-10, but they never had the opportunity to get that far because the AR-10 only lasts a couple of years in production before AI shuts it down. And that's a combination there are a combination of reasons behind that. Partly, Artillerie Inrichtingen wasn't selling as many of the guns as they were led to expect that they would. They thought they were going to be getting, massive orders for the things, and it ended up being 450 for Guatemala here, and 135 for West Germany there, and ooh, the big one, like 2,500 guns for Sudan. They wanted five-figure, like big five-figure, six-figure numbers, that kind of thing, and they never got them. In addition, there ended up being political ramifications to their production because the last major purchaser was Portugal, who was using these guns in Portuguese Angola. That became a very sensitive topic for the Dutch government, who decided that they didn't want to be seen as being involved in that colonial war and embargoed Dutch small arms shipments to Portugal. So, at any rate, production shuts down. Guatemala never gets more than their original 450 guns, and those guns hang out down there for almost 30 years. It's in 1985 when an American import company is out poking around, or I don't know exactly how the deal came into being, but they recognized that the Escuela Politécnica still had these AR-10s, and they were getting worn out. There wasn't really any need for them. By 1985, there are other guns. Obviously the AR-10 is not making a comeback by 1985. And so they arranged to purchase the guns from Guatemala, and they are imported into the US, and a lot of them are actually imported like this as pre-1986 dealer samples. At the time, they would have just been dealer samples, but that means they were imported as live, unmodified machine guns. They could only be owned by law enforcement or military agencies or machine gun dealers in the United States. But they decide most of the guns they will bring in and sell that way. They do cut some up as parts kits, but there's a much higher proportion of pre-86 dealer sample intact full auto Guatemalan AR-10s than for all of the other flavors of AR-10 that did make it back into the country. The Portuguese guns, for example, are virtually all parts kits. The Sudanese guns are almost, I think, all parts kits as well. It's the Guatemalan ones where you have the most actual, original, unmodified, full auto ones available, as long as you have the SOT to own a pre-86 dealer sample. So anyway, that's where this one came from. Really cool to get a chance to take a look at this. We'll do further in-depth videos on other AR-10 pattern rifles as I get my hands on them, because especially the Portuguese, it's interesting to see the transition from the really lightweight early models like the Guatemalan to the later, more feature-heavy and more weighty Portuguese NATO pattern AR-10s. Anyway, I'm rambling again now. So big thanks to Morphees for giving me the opportunity to film this one and show it to you guys. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.